Good morning and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Consortium of Communitarian Universities of Rio Grande do Sul State, COMUNG, webinar series in Brazil. My name is Professor José Miranda, and I'm the head of International Relations Office of La Salle University in Canoas, Brazil. I will moderate this webinar. It's a pleasure to receive the audience for another webinar promoted by the Internationalization of Higher Education group in COMUNG, where the best researchers from each university present their work. The Consortium of Communitarian Universities of the state of Rio Grande do Sul is formed by 14 universities with more than 8,000 professors and more than 11,000 employees, and with almost 200,000 students in a universe of 400,000 students enrolled in the state of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. It offers around 1,400 undergraduates and graduate programs, making it a suitable and reliable higher education system in operation in Rio Grande do Sul state. Community universities as COMUNG are not public, as the Brazilian government does not maintain them. They are a public asset marked by a strong link with their communities that represent a true network of education, science, and technology covering almost all municipalities in the state. They are authentic public, non-state, non-profit, democratic, and participatory institutions that prioritize quality in teaching, research, and extension. Considering the internationalization process in which these higher education institutions have been involved, many challenges are encountered. It's an honor to receive in this webinar series Dr. Tatiana Vargas Maya from La Salle University in Canoas. She is a PhD in political science from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale in the United States of America, has a master's degree in international relations from the Federal University of the State of Rio Grande do Sul, a bachelor in history from the State University of Rio Grande do Sul, also a bachelor in social science by the Pontifical Catholical University of the State of Rio Grande do Sul. She has experience in the field of political science with an emphasis on international relations, comparative politics, political theory, and in the area of history with an emphasis on modern and contemporary history. She also works mainly on the following themes: political identities, nationalism and ethnicity, international security, foreign policy, democracy, and authoritarianism, feminism, and gender. Currently, she is the Dean of International Relations Program and the Graduate Studies, and also Dean of the History Program at La Salle University in Canoas. She's also a permanent researcher and professor in the graduate program in social memories and cultural property at La Salle University. She also coordinates at La Salle Committee of University Pact on the promotion of respect for diversity, the culture of peace, and human rights, and representative at La Salle University Committee at the movement He for She, both of United Nations. Dr. Tatiana Vargas will bring us a conference about her research at La Salle University in the city of Canoas. The title of the presentation is The Whole Core of the Contemporary International System, Popular Sovereignty, Self-Determination, and Nationality. Any question regarding the conference can be used by the chat. At the end, Professor Tatiana Vargas Maya conference will pass the questions to be answered. I will moderate all the presentation. So please welcome Professor Tatiana Vargas Maya to this webinar conference, and please, you can begin.
Thank you so much for your great presentation, José. Good morning, all. What I'm presenting today is a continuation of my doctoral research in the sense that it seeks to further map and understand the place and the role of nationalism in international relations, both the academic subject and the field of study. My broad goal in this presentation is an attempt at establishing a dialogue among three different sets of literature that explore the structure and the dynamics of the contemporary international system, but that are often insulated from each other. First, the international law discussion on the nature of the state, rules, and rights in what could be called the society of states. Second, the political philosophy debate on patterns of justice and order within such society. And third, the social sciences and history argument regarding the emergency and role of nationalistic ideology in the configuration of international political dynamics since the late 18th century. In doing so, I continue to develop a line of inquiry, which I first started during my doctoral program and that I advanced in my dissertation, that could be summarized in the following question. How does nationalism, understood as a political ideology, affects the structure and the political dynamics of international relations? Despite the fact that nationalism is a widely used variable in the explanation of international trends and phenomena, it is frequently highlighted as the main cause of World War II, for instance, and it's regularly resorted to in accounts of resistance towards immigration flows. Nationalism as a topic of research is severely understudied, underexplored, and often ignored from consideration in formal examinations of international relations, being relegated by most efforts to the domestic arena. So it is not surprising to note that the majority of studies that elect nationalism as a topic of investigations are still confined to the field of comparative politics. Thus, in advancing a reflection on how nationalism, or nationness, as Benedict Anderson would rather denote, intersects and engenders the discussion on popular sovereignty and national self-determination, I seek to connect often secluded areas of discussion and to expand, and why not complexify, our understanding of the historical processes and the theoretical nuts and bolts of contemporary IR. Before I proceed in this examination, I would like to give you three main warnings. The first one concerns the level of analysis I am adopting here. As you may know, the theory of IR has been deeply marked by Walt's seminal book, Man, State, and War, in which the author advances three different images of international relations. That is, the three different realms in which we may look for the causes of international phenomena. The first image relates to the individual and is composed mostly of classical explanations that resort to conceptions of human nature as explanatory variables for the behavior of the states. The second image focuses on the domestic makeup of states, such as the economic system or the political regime. Finally, the third image is the systemic level, and it identifies the structure of the international system, an anarchical structure, as the main motivator for state behavior. The third image is the one preferred by Waltz in his explanations of international politics, and it is also the level of analysis I have chosen for my examination today. Although it may seem counterintuitive to choose the systemic level of analysis in a study about nationalism, this choice highlights exactly my main argument here, that despite the fact that we often think of nationalism as a domestic issue, we must consider its reach and importance in the construction of the contemporary international system, and to treat it as a structural feature of the system. In my view, it is impossible to accurately describe what I call, borrowing from both Mayo and Jackson Priest, the architecture of international relations without taking nationalism seriously. Of course, here I am arguing with Waltz against Waltz, in the sense that I'm recognizing the force and the influence of the structure of the international system, while abandoning his over-materialism, his excessive materialism, or at least reconsidering it by asserting that an ideational variable such as nationalism can be a relevant part of this structure. The second warning is very much related to this first discussion. I will not here focus on or explore the domestic dynamics of nationalism. I will not explore the dynamics of nation building, for instance. Several studies have already performed this text in a very competent manner. For me here, it suffices to point out that nation building is an intricate, complex, deeply political, and most of the time fuzzy process in order to highlight the challenges that its naturalization poses for the way in which we are accustomed to think about the international system. The third warning, the final warning, is more of a conceptual clarification on what I mean by nationalism. As a concept that is ironically plagued by vagueness in a similar fashion as populism, whenever we talk about nationalism, we seem to reenact Bagehot's assertion that we know what it is when you do not ask us, but we cannot very quickly explain or define it. Debates on the meaning of nationalism can be endless. For the purpose of this presentation, I adopt Hobsbawm's definition of nationalism as the ideology that the political and the national unities should coincide, and I combine it with Smith's definition of nationalism as an ideology that has three distinct and equally important goals: the unity, the identity, and the autonomy of the political community defined as the nation. Finally, this is a work in progress, and I think it's a very ambitious one for that matter. In the sense, I am chasing a rabbit in this presentation, and my hope, of course, is that I don't end up falling a rabbit hole. So, popular sovereignty and self-determination are commonly accepted as the core assumptions that ground both the legal and the political architecture of the contemporary international system. Together, they form a principle of legitimacy upon which the existence of states is predicated and determines how the relationships within and between these polities must occur. Despite the fact that the link between these assumptions seems straightforward at first, neither the concept of popular sovereignty nor the idea of self-determination are freestanding categories. Both require a definition of the people, that is, of the group of individuals who can collectively claim autonomy and exercise legitimate political authority. Although frequently defined as the population of a country, and often used without further concern for theoretical and political explanations, definitions of who the people are generally are ambiguous and disputed, involving the unsettled debates on the nature and boundaries of nations and of nationality. Here, I will explore this triangular relationship between the concepts of popular sovereignty, self-determination, and nationality, highlighting its inherent tensions and contradictions. My hypothesis is that because both the principles of popular sovereignty and self-determination depend upon an idea of the nation, the lack of a clear definition of what is a nation renders them hollow. The absence of an external objective criteria for the definition of nationality may, and frequently does, foment both uncertainty and instability within the international contemporary system. By mapping these issues and the internal contradictions of the legal and political structures that underlie contemporary international relations, I attempt to highlight that such contradictions are relevant in contemporary frameworks that insist on the centrality of the nation as the main actor in politics. And I suggest that it's necessary to first point at these contradictions to then overcome such centrality in order to deal with the complexities and challenges of the contemporary framework of international law and politics. By adopting a panoramic view of both the history of international relations and the history of the theory of international relations, we could propose a line of interpretation that asserts these two histories as a common history of the search for stability. This may sound obvious for an initiated ear. After all, hindsight is 2020. But I do think that insisting upon this characteristic as a guideline gives us an interesting key with which we can understand the historical developments that mark the empirical configurations and the theoretical efforts that constitute the field of international relations. Three different key dates in the history of IR may be used to highlight the search for this stability. First, 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. Second, 1789 with the French Revolution. Third, 1918 with the 14 points of Wilson. And if we want to stretch these considerations, we can reach up to 1960 with the Declaration of Decolonization, the UN General Assembly Resolution 1514. In different ways and in different moments, these events create, universalize, and fossilize the principles that order contemporary politics: sovereignty, popular sovereignty, and then finally self-determination. In its particular ways, each of these moments can be understood as juncture points that sought to rid specific political communities from the burdens of instability. Sovereignty, understood in 1648 as the coincidence between political power and territory, is originally designed as a mechanism to put an end to the religious wars of Europe, an instrument of stability after all. As stated by Mayo and Jackson Priest, the idea of sovereignty that emerged from the Peace of Westphalia reflected a territorial understanding of political power. From this time onwards, each and every state is understood to be a geographically self-contained political community with its own law and government. The notions of popular sovereignty and self-determination follow a similar path. Throughout the revolutionary moments of the United States, France, and Haiti, of course, in the end of the 18th century, as well as in the aftermath of World War I and II, different populations seemed once and again to pose the question of how to end the instability of dynastic and imperial rule. The answer these movements give repeatedly is that the political power should coincide not only with territory, but also with population. By the end of this long process, we find the present configuration of contemporary politics with which we have grown accustomed to. The idea that the contemporary state as the legitimate political organization that articulates and unifies government, territory, and population, the now centenary Weberian concept of the state. More so, this is a powerful political process because it is a globalized process. Following Tilley's history of the state, we must admit that the great novelty of the contemporary international system is not only the construction of this new form of political community we call the state, but the achievement of its universalization. The fact that for the first time in human history, the whole globe is politically organized following one single type of political ordering. This globalization of the state creates an interesting illusion. The notion that as long as we can manage and guarantee the coincidence between territory, power, and people, the stability of the international system is assured. This image is powerfully and banally represented in our political maps of the world. Clearly drawn borders delimiting the extension of the power of each of those unities. They are represented as a homogeneous space. And we must remember that this homogeneity is thought of being social, cultural, and political. And they are all colored in one single hue. It is, after centuries of conflict and disorder, an image of organization and stability, a perfect, finally assembled puzzle. There is a teleology to this interpretation that I find a bit disturbing. The naturalization of this description of the international system, both in our history and theoretical accounts, seems to imply that we have reached the ideal and final format of political organization, which not only is contradicted by empirical evidence, the fact that this image does not hold under closer scrutiny, the world is not as politically stable or organized, and the states are not as homogeneous as we like to think of them, but also does a disservice for our search for political alternatives that might be more responsive to some of the challenges we face today. Also, this account frequently ignores the core complicating variable of the constitution of the state that is as important, if not more, to our current state of political affairs as the notions of popular sovereignty and self-determination. Nationalism. While there may be no theoretical or political conflict between the principles of popular sovereignty and self-determination, trouble definitely arises when we finally need to consider nation. At first, including nation in this process we have been examining seems simple and straightforward. After all, we have been speaking of people since at least the last decades of the 18th century. To point that our political units are not just states, they are nation states. And this terminology is accepted and repeated without greater issues. However, taking nations seriously in the explanation of the composition of the contemporary international system poses us a very serious problem for the way in which we think and act in international law and politics. In order to do so, we need to answer the question of who, after all, is the people. What is the correct definition and what are the natural boundaries of the people whose rights were discovered in the 18th century? In the famous Ivor-Janine statement of 1956, on the surface, self-determination seems reasonable. Let the people decide. It was in practice ridiculous because the people cannot decide until someone decides who are the people. One of the frequent mistakes we make when talking about international relations, in that sense, is to accept the naturalization of the concept of the nation. This is the process Anderson calls nationness, that is, the common acceptance that in the modern world, everyone can, should, will have a nationality, as he or she has a gender. Such naturalization leads to the conclusion that the nation is the natural subdivision of humanity. Malky will call this the national order of things and adjust with the notion of course, a natural order of things. The theoretical acceptance of this national order of things could close and resolve our original triangulation of place, people, and power. That is, that popular sovereignty, self-determination, and nation fit together in a very neat way. And this is actually the status quo of part of our discussion in these matters. However, it is wise to remember that God gave physics the easy problems, and that despite the disagreements among scholars of nationalism regarding this issue, it is safe to assume that the contemporary manifestation of nations is not given unambiguously by history or nature. Quite the opposite. Nations, as we know them, are imagined, they are invented, created, fabricated. And we must always have an eye for who are the agents in these processes of nation building. Notwithstanding the fact that nations usually communicate a certain stability, here we are again talking once more about stability. After all, they have been here before us, they will probably be here after us. They are nothing but stable. A more careful historical analysis and considerations shows us that the actual composition of nations can and does change very quickly. For example, we can think of the changes Germany went through in the beginning of the 20th century, or we can look at the nation-building struggles that the United States is going through right now with their conceptions of citizenship. These changes have deep political impacts. Domestically, they shape dynamics of inclusion and exclusion with regards to political, economic, cultural, and social processes. While internationally, they can trigger demands for secession, produce the displacement of entire social groups, and even provoke conflict within and between different states. As Mayo and Jackson Priest explain, international society has assumed a contradictory stance towards national identity, depending upon the level, state or sub-state, at which it exists. On the one hand, international society seeks to preserve those national identities reflected in its plural state membership. At the same time, however, there is a tendency to control or suppress national identity within states, which threatens to disrupt or destabilize international order, defined as the continued existence of international society as a whole. Through these quick examples, we can understand how this core characteristic of nations, the fact that they are constantly being created, recreated, constructed, and reconstructed, can end up complicating the equation of stability established through the notions of popular sovereignty and self-determination. Once we understand the national identity is not self-evidence, that humanity is not naturally divided into nations, we also understand the fragilities and pitfalls that the principles of popular sovereignty and self-determination bring about. Differently from what we have grown accustomed to think, the notions of popular sovereignty and national self-determination are not freestanding concepts. They fundamentally rely on the idea of nation in order to function as intended. However, as we have seen, the composition of nations is not as objective as we usually think of it. Until we can consider this seriously, our theories and interpretations regarding international relations will remain fundamentally flawed. Let me be clear. I'm not advocating for us to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's not it. As a historian and a political scientist, I could hardly do so. All these concepts and principles that we are discussing fundamentally constitute the reality of our international system, and they're not going to go away anytime soon. My intention has been to show that despite the ubiquitous presence of the nation in our political vocabulary, we have not been scrutinizing its meanings, dynamics, and processes seriously enough, at least not in the field of international relations. And that this lack of curiosity for the essential role of nations and nationalism in the composition of the structure of the international system is damaging for our understanding of contemporary international phenomena. I'm not proposing that we forget nation, popular sovereignty, or national self-determination. Quite the opposite, in fact. These are principles and ideas that might carry some value in them. For instance, they enable us to think of political consent as the grounds for legitimate political power, the configuration of democratic regimes, and of citizenship rights. These are all very important ideas whose developments have been deeply entangled with the notions of popular sovereignty, self-determination, and nation. However, what I want us to do is to seriously include nations in our considerations, be them political or theoretical, and to recognize the implications this shift brings to our discussions. Stephen Walt asserts that nationalism is the most powerful political force in the world. And as you may have noticed, I'm very much in agreement with him. The belief that humanity is comprised of many different cultures, that is, groups that share a common language, symbols, and a narrative about their past, invariably self-serving and full of myths, and that those groups ought to have their own state, has been an overwhelmingly powerful force in the world over the past 2 centuries. Unless we fully appreciate the power and reach of nationalism, in short, we're going to get a lot of things wrong about the contemporary political life. Thank you. José, eu acho que your microphone is off.
Thank you, Professor Tatiana Vargas Maya, for your wonderful explanation. Certainly, it's a very complex international scenario that we are facing nowadays. Sometimes it's not easy to be understood. Let's see if you have any question. I have one question for you as also a professor in the area of international relations. Considering that we are facing a very complex international system nowadays, do you consider that the concept of sovereignty and the nation state could change in the future?
Thank you for your question, José. Well, I think it has been changing. And I think that's one of the problems sometimes when we are thinking of it and researching and even teaching international relations, we fail to address and to emphasize to our students how these concepts that we deal with, they change and they are interpreted in different manners depending on political and historical contexts, right? So the concept of sovereignty we deal with in 2020 is radically different from that of the Peace of Westphalia. We can definitely see the links and the histories and the development of it. But I do think sometimes we make and we reproduce this mistake of naturalizing these concepts as if they are stable and they're not changing throughout the centuries. So yes, of course, as it has changed before and it was different in the 19th century, it will be different in the 21st century as well. In a sense, my provocation in today's talk is exactly that we need to stop seeing these concepts as fixed in time and as representing the same reality throughout the centuries, and actually look at the ways they change and evolve, because I do think this consideration of change will reveal a lot about how we understand and think about international relations. I've been very annoyed on how 20th century international relations looks a lot at stability and is fixated with strong concepts without allowing for the possibility of including change and variation within our analysis. And I think that's one of the paths we need to seek in order to advance our understanding and to advance our theories of IR.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think we're going to have any questions right now. So I would like again to thank you very much, Professor Tatiana Vargas Maya, to be with us during this webinar series. In the name of the Consortium of Communitarian University of the State of Rio Grande do Sul, I would like to thank you again, Professor Tatiana from Salle University, for his participation on this webinar series. I also would like to invite the audience for the next Común series webinar in the 13th October with the theme La Agenda 2030 y los ODS como plataforma para conectar a la comunidad latinoamericana, with Professor Daniel Rubens Sensing from Ijuí Universities. This webinar will be in Spanish. Thanks for your attention and see you in the next Común webinar series. Bye-bye.